Welcome to our presentation titled Collaborative Web-Based Testing for Product and Software Development, featuring David Merrill of Polarion. I'm your host, Francesca Mathieu. Before we begin, I'd like to explain how to participate in today's event. This presentation contains streaming video and content. To optimize bandwidth, please be sure to close any unnecessary applications that may be running in the background. You'll notice a widgets toolbar at the bottom of your console. Click on the appropriate widget to view the speaker bio and presentation abstract. Click the Handouts widget to download the speaker's presentation to your virtual briefcase. Loving the presentation? Send a tweet through our Twitter feed through the Twitter widget. Also, please send us your feedback through the presentation via our short 4-question survey. Now, to submit a question, use the moderated chat panel. Technical questions will be answered within the chat, and we will try to get to each of your questions to the speaker during the Q&A portion after his presentation. And now I'd like to turn things over to David Merrill on the floor here at Star East.
Good afternoon. My name is David Merrill, and it's my pleasure to be here today. On behalf of Polarion, it's our privilege to address you today and talk about some issues associated with web-based collaboration in test case management and quality assurance. It's a favorite statement of mine by Robert Johnson, who said, "The world is run by those who show up." And so for those of you who attend this conference, for those of you joining via virtual and on-site audience, I hope I'll do justice to this topic. Now, this is not going to be a passive PowerPoint slide presentation. My intention is that we'll be hands-on, and you'll be able to see actual cases running through the software as we build a scenario that we can see from problem to solution. Part of what I'm going to be talking about today is also recognizing and avoiding some of the great quality assurance failures, the catastrophes, if you will, that oftentimes aren't so much caused by very fine technical errors or details, but sometimes by the more simple problems of communication. And we're going to address one of those that has come up in the last 30 days as well, with the overheating iPad problem. We'll talk primarily about testing-centered collaboration and all the things, all the facets and artifacts and operations and processes surrounding that. I'll introduce for you using a risk analysis called FMEA into this quality assurance solution and see how that will impact our use of test case management and test execution today. And certainly we'll talk about managing both manual and automated tasks and tests. Now, for those of you in the audience and virtually, I would encourage you to write down questions. At the end of my presentation, I will be addressing and giving an opportunity for you to ask questions. Normally, I'm used to a much more interactive audience. In fact, sometimes I struggle with the idea of answering the question, what do I do for a living? And if I dive deep into the ideas associated with application lifecycle management, of traceability and auditability between test cases and, between test cases, requirements, and other development artifacts, usually the people trying to figure out what I do glaze over in their eyes and they lose track. But if instead of that I talk about, as an engineer with Polarion, I build sensors that keep military and medevac helicopters in flight and make sure that the management and the maintenance of those systems are done on time when they need it. I tell them that I manufacture neurosurgical equipment that helps still the tremors of Parkinson's disease, and that I'm actually on the cutting edge of green technology, creating hydrogen fuel cells and solar-powered vehicles. Well, of course, I don't actually do that. But these are the real stories of Polarion customers that I've worked with in the past few weeks and months. And I attribute much of my work in the efforts and development of their products. But sometimes quality is not so assured. And as an example, Nokia recently announced to its customers with AT&T that they would be refunding or rather crediting $100 on their bill, not because of the phone device, but because of the software that was running on the phone. In 2011, the Ford Motor Corporation fell from 5th to 23rd in overall perceived customer satisfaction by J.D. Powers. Not because the fuel efficiency was a problem or the vehicles did not drive well or couldn't be maintained, but because of the software console in the center of the machine. And in 2010, McAfee released an antivirus patch which coincidentally crashed tens of thousands of computers. And in an embarrassing day for McAfee, they reported that that software release left McAfee without having some of the primary and functional software tests that should have been performed prior to the release. Polarian as a solution exists to avoid these catastrophes. So let's take a look at the last 30 days at Apple. Now, you may be thinking, why am I talking about Apple and iPads today when really I work for Polarian? And this will hopefully build a very interesting case study for us to consider and use as a context for our use of Polarian. So in the first 3 days of the iPad being released to the public, they sold 3 million copies. Shortly after that, Consumer Reports announced that under certain circumstances, the iPad heated up to 116 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can see here an image of the infrared of an iPad 2 compared to an iPad 3 and the temperature scale. So almost immediately, the blog space lit up with customer feedback. And here's an example of one, that they were ready to return the iPad because it was uncomfortably warm. And Apple, in fact, comments, in fact, today we really don't know if it's a problem or what the cause is, but Apple commented that it's really not a problem, but you can return your iPad if you'd like to. Well, why is this such an interesting study for quality assurance? Well, it's a very popular device, and there's a lot of public hype around it. The new iPad actually fuels much of Apple's production and their overall revenue. In fact, in the first quarter of 2012, Apple sold more iPads than they sold of all their desktop and laptop computers combined. The iPad is mechatronics. And by that I mean it's not just software. It's a physical device with its aesthetic design. It contains circuit boards and intelligent chipware, and the firmware and software that drive that, and very innovative user interfaces, all presented to the user. So when we say the cause of the overheating iPad is unknown, we really don't know right now. Is it software? Is it hardware? Is it even a problem? When will it be fixed? Should I take my iPad back, or should I just live with it? Now this touches home for me because I am an owner of an iPad 3 as well. So what I'd like to do then is start looking at how Polarian, a user of Polarian, would approach this. And we'll begin with an FMEA study. Now, an FMEA is a certain type of risk analysis. It's actually called failure mode effects analysis. It was originally developed by the U.S. military, later adopted by NASA, largely by the automotive industry, and is gaining widespread adoption in both medical and software manufacturers. Perhaps you heard recently about the hack that released many thousands of credit card IDs because of a software vulnerability for the company that processed credit card transactions. Well, traditionally, FMEA analysis existed as spreadsheets in a static silo. What Polarian would like to do is take the idea of this risk analysis and make it come alive, because we expect that type of risk to begin to interact with our business cases, with our requirements, with our system design, and ultimately any of the artifacts which build and define our products. So the severity and the occurrence, the the scoring associated with FMEA is something that we'd like to see modeled in Polarian. And we want to be able to take the actions associated with mitigating an FMEA study and bring it out of the spreadsheet into the real work item world of the artifacts that business analysts and developers and testers interact with daily. And ultimately, the ability to interact still at the level of the spreadsheet is important with something that we call round trip in Polarian. Well, let me move to a demonstration scenario. This demonstration scenario for our iPad case study is that in the initial usage of the iPad of a prototype, the lead test engineer realizes that it's just simply a little bit warmer than her iPad 2. So what do we do about it? Well, in Polarian, we're going to create an FMEA risk work item. And then we're going to start working on all of those special items, artifacts, and units of work that will help mitigate this risk. And so ultimately, for us in our discussion of QA, we want to be able to see firm test cases, both manual and perhaps also automated, which address verifying the resolution or the mitigation of these failed instances. So I'm going to move now from this PowerPoint to the Polarian user interface. Polarian is a web application, and you can access it from any browser, as we'll see. I'm running on Macintosh with Firefox, but you could just as easily be accessing it on handheld devices and Windows and Internet Explorer. The landing page gives you a home space to be able to define a project. In my case, it's an iPad project for our conference here today. Without too much more ado, I'm also going to mention that when I come to Polarian, one of the first things that I would do is take a look at the My Polarian space, where my activities are defined for me. These are going to be the tasks and defects assigned to me, perhaps the test cases associated to me for approval or refinement. And I can also see the current activity streams of all the other things that are going on within my Polarian projects and repository. And so this is a common place for me to come to start resolving the work items that have been assigned to me. But what I'd really like to be able to do is develop further the idea of this risk work item. And so here I have in this screen two artifacts which are defined as FMEA risks. And so you can see the first one is that the iPad 3 might overheat and become uncomfortable to handle. And since that's already in the system, you can see that I can open up and see all of the different artifacts which have already been linked to the mitigation of these particular risk items. So in completion of my exercise here, I'll highlight this idea of the iPad 3 becoming too hot to handle. And down below, in this lower workspace, I have all of the other attributes that are assigned to this particular work item artifact. And so through here, I can assess either additional effect information. I can enter in the severity rating. How severe is this overheating? On a scale of 1 to 10, I would rate this maybe a 4. Cause and occurrence. What is causing this overheating problem, and how often does it occur? Well, if it doesn't occur very often, I'll score it a 2. And later on, as I move through here, how often will it be detected? Well, if I don't have any automated controls, if I don't have alerts to the user finds out, Consumer Reports finds out, when the device becomes too hot. So this score is very high, a detection rating of 10. And so when I complete this information, it will recalculate what's called a risk priority number. And the risk priority number is something which becomes part of this artifact that I can use in meetings that associate risk. Now, why is this important to test case management? Because in mitigating this risk, I can create things like change requests. And these change requests might be as simple as saying Apple should create a special iPad cover that helps dissipate the heat before it heats up too much. Or it could be, as we see down below, a change request that authors a new requirement. And ultimately for us, once everything has been mitigated, then I want to be able to create a special test case which will take the idea of this risk of the iPad heating up too much and make sure I can verify it. So I'm going to create here a new test case. And this test case, from the moment it gets created, will be permanently linked to this risk item. And so when I consider things like tracing the authorship or the approval status of this particular test case, I'll always be able to see its origins. Who did it? When did they do it? And what was the additional change? So the test might be test temperature of iPad 3. And just to make things simple, I'll create that very simply, and then we'll move on. And each time I add to that, you can see immediately that the information that becomes linked between the test case and the risk item is automatically rendered, not just for me, but for anybody who's using Polarian globally. Let's return back to our case study for a moment and move on to the next scenario. Because now that we've established that there's risk, we want to make sure that we can transform this risk into quality assurance. Well, how do we do that? As a best practice, everything that happens within the life cycle of any product or service requires full visibility. And so we need to be able to eliminate any static documents. Documents that sit on file servers or on SharePoint implementations become stale. And I run the risk of not looking at the most current version of the most current test specification, so test cases can be missed. Just ask the Toyota Corporation what the cost of one missing test case might have been if that test case were about the floor mat in some of their automobile models or the accelerator pedal malfunction they encountered. I can allow simultaneous multiple users to have access to these specifications so that truly I can collaborate on a worldwide level. And then additionally, we make all of the artifacts available to all responsible parties and roles. So even though I'm a tester, I can still have access to viewing and seeing those privileged items for requirements and designs. Well, let's continue. In Polarian, importing documents is very easy. We're able to import Word and Excel and other document formats and begin to deconstruct them, deconstructing them from their stale and static form into more of a living document where we're not managing the document file, but actually the content of the document itself. And using the round-trip capability, I will always be able to use the vehicle of Word and Excel to communicate to my outside stakeholders that might not have access to the Polarian system. And in Polarian, I still maintain very easy-to-use document views that let me use the same editing niceties of Word and Excel to maintain the information in these documents. So our scenario now is, once we have Polarian, how can we quickly and efficiently get documents that might be on our file systems, or documents like a test specification that could be coming from a supplier or an independent software organization, or an open source location that manufactures a certain library that I'll be using. How can I quickly bring these things into my Polarian project to begin to use them immediately? So we'll want to import these documents and further develop and refine them, and ultimately lead to approved test cases which can be executed. So we'll be able to interact with those FMEA risks that we talked about and build traceability between test cases and requirements. So I'm going to shift now and go back to my Polarian user interface and start to develop some of the other concepts. Now what you see here actually addresses a slightly different question, which is, are we on time and do we have the capacity to perform tests and development tasks? So all along in Polarian, as I build my live documents, I also have a live plan of capacities and personnel and availability for assignments. And this can be tracked across all projects or be limited to one specific project view. We'll begin taking a look at actually I'll skip that. We'll come back to that. I want to be able to introduce importing these documents. So I'm going to open up Word, and you'll see here in my screen view that I have a user acceptance test for the iPad 3. It's in a common Word format. It carries the normal headers and information that you're used to seeing, and then includes the specifications associated with both the test cases and discrete test steps. I want to get that into Polarian. So here in this view, in the Polarian user interface, I've prepared this document for import, and I'm in what's called a preview mode. On the left-hand side, you see the document as it's been imported into Polarian. And moving through the different parts of the view, iconically we'll be able to see that new items have been tagged on the left-hand side to indicate where I have specific test cases and individual test steps. All of this decomposition happens according to the rules that you see on the right-hand side of the screen. So it's going to move through the document and create test cases anytime it sees a particular occurrence of a word pattern or a heading style or any number of criteria that you would establish. Additionally, it will move through the document and find test steps based on the occurrence of a list item inside of an overall definition of a test case. And so I can refactor this information, adding more or less criteria to be able to import virtually any document without having known about what that document looks like prior to importing into Polarian. Additionally, I think it's important to note that while I'm using Word, Excel is also an important vehicle for importing specifically test specifications. Once I've completed this process, I can click the import button in the lower right-hand side. And that's now going to take the temporary information of the preview and bring it in permanently into my Polarian server, where now I'll have complete access to those artifacts and be able to refine them and make them available for testing. So while that's going on, let's move back to take a look at how we begin to affiliate these new test cases with our requirements. And in other areas in Polarian, I can also move and see what requirements documents look like. So here's an example of a requirements document with different types of icons that identify a different type of artifact. And in the document view, it's very easy to come in with the appropriate rights and, for example, create a new bullet point and add to the list of requirements for a particular item, or also to augment and modify test cases as well. And while I'm editing just as one person in one document, certainly I expect to have many people editing this document at the same time. Moving back to our test specification, as we go and take a look at it, you can see that now I have a formal test case with its title and artifact ID that has been created by Polarian, identifying the expected results and then specific test steps. And again, from this area, I can further refine this. So if I choose to modify a test step, for example, let's delete this one, then I can easily perform those actions right here and move on and save this specification in the document view. Moving from the document view into a more detailed system view of the table itself, I can begin to see the additional attributes that become important to building and managing all of these test cases. And I won't go into too much more detail here. We'll see that a little bit later on in our process. Okay, Now let's move on to the next part of our scenario. Once we have brought in test specifications and begun to define the test cases, we want to be able to manage all the different types of test execution. So let's begin with a practice of being able to collaborate during test execution, so that test execution by itself does not become a silo of information. We want to permit simultaneous access of the different types of tests. I should have a test run which can be accessed by more than one tester at the moment. As a manager, I should be able to view all of this information and know when and where and who performs certain tests. And of course, I'd like to be able to report on these results and view them within the context of my overall release planning and see the defects or the problems that become created when tests fail. So in Polarion, test execution is performed in the same common interface that we've already seen. We do web-based test execution and certainly support offline test execution through vehicles of Microsoft Word and Excel where necessary. The test cases will be organized into test runs, and these test runs will be what we ultimately execute. In the demonstration scenario now, we'll have a test engineer performing a full manual test of the iPad system test that we've been working on. So I'll actually create a Polarion test run, and we'll execute that test run in the Polarion interface. We'll see that we immediately see the progress, we see the status, and we begin to manage and collaborate on the defects right away. So I'm going to pull back into my Polarion interface. I'm going to return to the initial tab here and view the testing space. Now, when I view the testing space, I have a particular landing page that's a little bit obscured because of the resolution of the monitor at the moment, but I'll move it from side to side. From this location, I can see graphics which identify the process, and I will also be able to see all of the different test runs that have previously executed or are executing currently. And so here we can see a combination of both automated tests and manual tests that have executed in past, or executed and generally failed, or are in the middle of execution currently. And my activity stream on the right-hand side provides me with centric information to the specific test cases themselves. Well, let's begin with creating a test run. And so when I create a test run, let's give it a name. And we'll pick a certain template. Now, you can maintain many different types of test templates. We're going to select a full manual system test. When I create the test run, it's going to query the information, the database of test cases that meet the criteria for this full manual test and provide me this initial dashboard. And so I can see the progress and include and add to the information about this test case, for example, or this test run. What build did I execute? And so let me pick a build number. And I'll save and return back to the initial test run. When I'm ready to execute, I'll click the Execute Test button. And in executing this test, I'll open up the Polarion user interface that's highlighted just to the tests that are included here. And I have a special abbreviated view of the attributes so I can easily move through here and record the test information. So if a test is passed, like I'm working on a machine with 12 gigabytes of system memory, I can just click the passed button and I move on to the next test case. And so forth. If I'm not looking at a 32 gigabyte and this particular item isn't applicable, I can block the test, meaning that I don't perform it. And then I also can move throughout and execute any particular test case in this area. So let's say I highlight the accelerometer test, and I'm going to fail this test case. And then I'll move through and just simply fail a few more test cases as examples. As I move through and both pass and fail certain test cases, the information that is being recorded is always available in the Polarian test run information. So here, with simply refreshing the browser, I'll be able to see, of the original 36 test cases which I started to execute, I've executed 5, 2 have passed, 2 have failed, and 1 has been blocked. And down further in the dashboard, I'll be able to see the results of the non-passed test cases. In some cases where I failed the test case, I'll be able to visualize the defect which has been automatically created. And since everything is hyperlinked, I'll be able to move directly to the defect if I'm a developer, and be able to make assignments or begin work on that defect immediately. And at any point, I can return back to the test case and execute. Now, for those situations where offline testing is indicated, from this original screen as well, I can export test cases to Excel, to that format that might be necessary for underwriter laboratories to be able to perform your set of tests as they evaluate your device or your software, or to any outside testing organization, or even an organization within your own company. And so when I open this particular document, actually, let me go back. I think I have too many documents open. So now that I've found the right test document to work on, you can see the same information in Excel that you had when you were working in Polarian. So item by item through the test cases, I can register the test result, passed, failed, or blocked, and I can also register a testing comment, just like I could within the interface. And so I can move through here as an outside tester and register all these values. Let me save this. In fact, I'm going to save this to the desktop so I can find it a little easier, because I'm ready to complete the complement to this export process, and that is to bring the test results back into Polarian. So here from this dashboard as well, I can import the test results directly from Excel, and I'm directed to specify the file that contains those test results, and I'll open that up on my desktop. Now, if I had already executed these test cases, then I can cause those tests to be retested, re-executed based on the information of the spreadsheet. Here you can see in summary that it specifies 2 test cases have been executed, 1 has passed, and 1 has failed. And when I return to the dashboard and it recalculates, I'll see the new score and the new value here. So just to make a long story short, why don't we say that since we have 3 failed test cases for this test run, I'm going to fail the entire test run so that I don't have to stop and I don't have to continue executing these to be able to return the status back to my project. And so while I'm just one person working on one test run here, you can imagine that if this were a very complex scenario of test cases, I could likely have many test engineers performing specific tests in their area of expertise with this one test run all at the same time. And of course, I would have many test runs which are being executed against many different software builds or different manufactured devices at the same time, all easily calculated from the original Polarian test run space. I can always return to this home page and be able to see some of the latest information about the executed test cases in the last few days and all of the current test run information. Now, one of the things that becomes very important to a process-based testing environment is the appropriate coverage of test cases to requirements. And so I breezed on it briefly a little bit earlier, but what I'd like to be able to do is actually take a look more closely at the idea of building and demonstrating and reporting on test case coverage in Polarian. And so this is a traceability table. This traceability table, this particular one, has 3 columns, one for requirements, one for test cases, and one for defects, any defects that have been created against failed test cases. And you can see that I have an association sometimes of one test case to one requirement, sometimes many test cases to one requirement, and in fact, I can support in Polarian a many-to-many relationship. And if I move through this table to view, anytime I see a gap in that middle column is an indication that I have a requirement that does not have a covering test case. And so if I were Apple, it would be essential for me to build this matrix and complete it so that each requirement, system requirement, user requirement, or software specification had a corresponding test case to validate it. And we'll talk a little bit more in the next demonstration scenario about test cases here down at the bottom. And what I wanted to point out is that in this particular area, I have a combination of both manual test cases, which are traced to requirements, and automated test cases, which are also traced to the appropriate requirement. Now, if I do have a requirement that's missing a test case, it's very simple for me from this location to hyperlink directly to the requirement in question, and from that requirement, create a new test case which validates it. And so I'll create a verifying test case directly from this screen. I'll do it very quickly, but you can certainly imagine that this process should and likely follows its own approval process, where test cases are developed, defined, refined, and approved before they're ultimately tested. Now, once I build this one item here, if I return to the traceability table and simply recalculate it, either by refreshing the browser or by simply reapplying the query, I'll be able to refactor all that information and move down to the bottom. And instead of having that one missing column, now you can see that AP-627 is now covered by a test case specific to it. And so whether this traceability information is viewed in this format or in other areas of Polarian, it becomes essential to establishing the relationships between all of your living artifacts. Well, let's continue with the next aspect of maintaining test execution in Polarian, and that's testing on mobile devices. So I've been working on my computer here, but we have a customer who, as I was working with them, had tests taking place out in their parking lot. They manufactured forklifts. And so I saw as I was working there that people were performing these tests and scoring the test right there in the parking lot. So the idea of being able to take the device mobily into the environment becomes important to eliminate offline testing wherever possible. Wireless and 3G and 4G capability are ubiquitous, and so we can bring these tests directly to the test location. That way we can leverage user authentication so that the right person is performing the right test at the right time. We can also enforce and have powerful Polarian workflows behind the entire test execution process, rather than seeing that happen on a spreadsheet and waiting until that information comes back into Polarian to be able to visualize the results. So this is something that we'd like to be able to do, not just for Polarian and software, but for all types of products. So I have here my beloved iPad 3, and even though you won't be able to see this, I have a page here that has an entire testing run ready to go. And I'm just going to hit this, and I'm going to pass a test, and then I'm going to go on to the next test, and I'm going to fail the test. Because our next scenario is actually to take this out to you. So I have a lovely assistant here who's going to pass this around, and I encourage you to take a look at and execute some of these Polarian tests. For those of you in the virtual audience, I'm sorry I can't pass that around to you, but I can encourage you to visit Polarian.com, where you can run test drives of the QA solution online. And while you can't perform it on the iPad, you certainly could connect with an iPad and do similar capabilities. This particular view has been built to show only those parts of information that are relevant to a tester. I've logged on with a testing ID, and so I have a limited view for that particular role. And that might be a very different role than a testing manager, or a developer, or a requirements engineer. So while that's going around and you have an opportunity to use it, let's also talk about another critical part of testing, and that is managing automated tests. So similar to FMEA risk that often exists as an independent silo, sometimes we find that automated tests execute in the realm of the developer, where the results are stored in a report or information that is not assimilated with the rest of manually performed tests and associated to requirements or other design artifacts. And so these discrete testing methods are often not visible to stakeholders or to compliance auditors when we have to demonstrate the appropriate traceability of both automated and manual tests for specific requirements and features. So in Polarian, automated tests are automatically added. We have the ability to monitor continuous integrations, whether through Polarian, Maven, Hudson, Jenkins, to be able to take the results of those automated tests and involve them immediately in Polarian test cases. And so whether you're using Java or other programming languages, if it supports XUnit, or if you use the programming tools in Polarian to support virtually any type of reporting interface, we'll be able to take that information and make it available to those users of Polarian in the project. So for our scenario this time, as a development manager, I'm going to launch a build. Now, probably I have this build going on nightly anyway. If I'm an agile development software shop, then it's very likely that very fast iterations are leading to nightly builds and nightly unit tests. But for us here, I'm going to launch a software build to build a fictitious application of an iOS interface emulator. And with the results of that, we'll be able to see both the test results as well as how those automated test cases link specifically to requirements. And we'll revisit that testing matrix, that traceability matrix, and see where automated tests and manual tests combine. So back into my Polarian interface, I'm going to move down to the bottom and expand and see some more detailed information about project navigation. And so here would be the location of project dashboards that could be available to executives and manager levels that perhaps aren't interested in the most discrete and fine information of the project, but rather the overall question of, is the project on track and will we be able to release on time? Part of that is the builds area. And so here, a little bit like test runs, I have the ability to open and run builds that are activated against the software which has been checked into, committed into repositories that Polarian can access. So I'm going to select not just a default build, but I'm going to run a build that performs all automated tests. And I'll start that process. So you'll see in the interface that that process is going to be launched in the background, and we'll be able to monitor its success. In fact, I'm going to return back to my testing space, the main area to see the results of test cases and test runs. And we can see already that that test has completed. It's a very fast process. And so let's take a look at the results here. Well, here, when we pull up this particular test run, it's a test that no human has ever done, but there were only 9 test methods which were executed. Of them, 7 passed, 1 failed, and 1 was blocked on purpose, actually. And as we move down through here, we can see the specific results of why the block occurred and what the return or the information in the X unit or J unit results information was that contributed to a particular defect. And when Polarian encounters multiple failures of the same test case, it knows not necessarily to create a defect each and every time unless you want it to. Specifically with automated tests, Polarian will allow you to define a threshold of a summary defect which can be created if a certain percentage of the unit tests fail and others succeed. So that if you had a unit test not so much with just 7 items, but if I had thousands of items and I was performing nightly builds, I wouldn't necessarily want to add 800 defects every night based on an agile development method that had constant change going on to the main line of development. So we'll be able to control how much or how little defect information is produced as part of this process. And of course, everything is hyperlinked together, so I can move from this number here directly to the location that shows me test case and defect. And I can open the defect up and see the traceability of that particular defect to its test case that triggered it. And so I will always be able to see what happens and when it happened. In fact, this defect is going to link back to a specific revision of a test case. So a week from now, when this test case is a little bit different, we will know that this particular defect was triggered based on today's occurrence of the test case. Now, as we move and revisit the idea of traceability, this is where I'd like to point out, again, down at the bottom of this traceability table, I have a requirement that I sort of glazed over, and that is the iPad iOS shall boot up in a user-friendly way and be easy to log on to and log out of. Well, it's supported by 2 automated test cases and 2 manual test cases. Here's the 2 manual test cases that show test steps for both login and power off. And then I have 2 automated tests whose title, whose name demonstrate that it is the test method of a particular Java JUnit test. Okay. Well, one of the things that we probably should also do is check back into the progress of the mobile testing application. And you can see it's already in progress. And now when I view it, instead of seeing, I think we started out with the possibility of 50 test cases, you can see that 7 test cases have executed, 3 passed, 2 failed, and 2 were blocked. So regardless of where that iPad is, and I hope we didn't have a drop test of the iPad, and I hope we don't have a loss prevention test of the iPad, but regardless of where that iPad is and what's going on, as a manager, I will always be able to see and act on this information. Okay. Well, finally, we come to the point where we would expect that we're ready to release products. So Polarian drives artifacts with workflows. This helps us ensure that all the information that has to be in place is in place before releases occur. Take McAfee, for example. With Polarian, it would be possible to never be able to allow an authorized release of an antivirus patch if all of the test cases associated to a particular release have not been executed. And if any of those executed and failed, that there's an that there's a defect. And if there is a defect, that defect has been resolved and has source code which has been committed to that particular defect, and that defect has been further retested. All of these different rules can be established in a Polarian workflow to make sure that when you need to enforce the testing strategies for overall quality assurance, that it's impossible to release something that doesn't fit and follow your own process. So workflows can prevent failure. Polarian integrates with other tools. As you could have seen today, Polarian is not an integrated development environment, but it does integrate with Eclipse and Microsoft Visual Studio. And we have a live bus adapter, which allows Polarian to interact at a data level with many other third-party utilities, and is really an open framework for you to be able to plug into virtually any other database, which may contain test information, issues that you might see in Jira or BugTrack or Bugzilla, or requirements or other artifacts that are contained in external systems. Now, for the conclusion of our demonstration, we can imagine that the executive management has verified all the requirements. All these completed test runs have been staged for release. And ultimately, we can approve and release this with electronic signature. Well, what that will allow me to do now, let's imagine that I am that administrator. I am that executive preparing for a release. In the section that allows me to build and manage my release planning, this is where I can ultimately see all of the items which are part of the product backlog for this particular release and any future releases. So here with the scoreboard, you can see the status of the particular requirements. Have they been completed? Are they all approved? Have they been accepted and verified? And I can see both any business cases as well as requirements that were included in that release. Well, what I'm going to do is move into the business case side of things, and I'll have this collection of high-level requirements, not so much for feature and functionality, but is the iPad going to contribute to Apple's bottom line? Will it be part of that ecosystem? Will there be negative repercussions because the iPad is overheating? Maybe it really isn't our fault, but the perception is that the iPad overheats. And with this information, I can very easily highlight all of these business requirements and move them through the workflow process from approved to ultimate verification and completeness. And so if this were combined with more rigorous workflows, then I would make sure that all the associated requirements, all the associated design specifications, all the associated test cases were all in place and in their appropriate state of completeness before it would allow me to continue in this process. And where necessary, key fields for information can be completed, and so I can include as much or as little required information to get to the point of verification. I can have electronic signatures in place which allow me to, or force me as a manager to re-authenticate to Polarian and place an electronic signature in the audited record. So finally, in conclusion, I'd like to mention that Polarian really is driven by its customers. Just like I identify with what our customers do, Polarian identifies with that. And you can see here in the list of customers a wide array of software manufacturers, aerospace manufacturers, medical and automotive as well. Very much on the cutting edge of bringing the world's products and services to market. What you've been able to see is the Polarian architecture bringing these kinds of tools to you with an agile velocity. So we'll be able to plug into the browsers that you use today. We'll be able to use the integrated development environments that you use today, the Office products that you use today, but also provide an extremely powerful layer of SDK and programming APIs so that you will have exactly the same tools at your disposal that our own developers have and use to build the product. And Polarian is backed also by a rich ecosystem of contribution from partners and customers that create new templates like the FMEA project template and innovations which can be brought to other Polarian users on the Polarian extensions page. And I think it's important to note that while we were focusing a little bit on the iPad as a mechatronic device, Polarian as a product and certainly as a company is targeted towards incorporating all methodologies, not just software solutions, but also, and not just manufacturing, but any method and any combination of information. I've been able to span from risk to requirement to test case seamlessly because I'm using all aspects of Polarian, but it would be just as easy to use the Polarian QA solution only to address your test case management needs that are not being met today. So instead of incorporating test specifications into Polarian, you might be bringing in your own company's requirements documents that exist someplace else. Once in Polarian, you can establish the round-trip capability for further update and establish the kind of traceability that you need to have in place so that you know the right tests are being performed to the right builds for the right requirements. Some next actions that I might recommend. Well, it's a little late maybe to visit our booth here at Star East, but virtually I'm sure, and afterwards you can visit Polarian to test drive the same type of tools you saw today online, or download a fully functional evaluation copy and install very quickly and easily in your own environment. There's also white papers, and you're welcome to email me. I very much would appreciate your feedback and your questions to understand what are the things that drive you, the challenges you face, and what you look to solve. So that concludes my part of the presentation, and thank you very much for an invitation to join you. I'd like to just turn it over and see if there are any questions that I might be able to address at the end. Of course, yes.
Okay, this comes from our virtual audience. Does Polarian have a component that works with UA as well as QA testing?
I'm not exactly sure what those acronyms happen to mean, but Polarian supplies through its Live Bus adapter connectors to many other types of product testing tools as well. We have the ability to tie into Selenium output and incorporate that into Polarian through HP Quality Center. So I would encourage for whoever asked that question perhaps to come back and follow up with me, and I'll be able to get a better response for that particular topic. Please.
Okay. Earlier you had a slide on which this gentleman saw pass, failed, blocked, executed, and waiting. Are there test cases that have started but not passed, failed, blocked, for example, in progress, summarized in the executed?
Yes. The ones that are executed have either had passed, failed, or blocked marked by a tester. However, the other thing that sort of incorporates into this is you've really only seen one example of using the Polarian framework to be able to build a testing methodology. This was, if you will, my conception of an embodiment of a best practice. Everything that you saw here is both easily usable and also customizable to match whatever your testing results ought to be. So if blocked is not a viable result for your test, then passed and failed can be the only one. Or waiting could actually be a viable test result from a tester. When we saw waiting in the dashboard, that meant an unexecuted test, waiting in the course of that test run to be executed by a tester. So pulling up an example here for our mobile testing scenario. Here where we'll see I think it was 43 some odd test cases, 42. Somebody ran another test case. That means that those are 42 tests waiting to be executed. And as a testing manager with the appropriate rights, I can summarily end and complete this test run because of the existence of failures, or actually encourage it to test to completeness because I'm looking for overall results. Excellent question. Yes, any other questions also from the audience too? I don't want to only monopolize with the virtual audience. Okay. Well, is there one more question?
Sure. Do you generally have access to the same location in which your developers are putting code, or do you get a copy of everything?
By and large, most Polarian customers have global presences. That means that many times the testers are not co-located with the developers or the designers or the business analysts. However, in Polarian, you can either include the source code within the Polarian project information, or you can refer to and, if you will, monitor external source code repositories. But there is no requirement that the people creating the tests, executing the tests, and performing the development actions have to be in the same location. Okay, well, thank you very much, and I appreciate your contributions and attention today. Thanks.
That wraps up this event. Thank you for joining us. Please check the presentation center for the last presentation that we have running, and I'll just go ahead and tell you that it will be starting in about 15 minutes. But if you would, I invite you to go over to the interviews panel, where you may be able to catch a couple of minutes of James and Bart interviewing each other. Afterward, please come back to the presentation panel to where you can watch the last presentation of the day and for the whole Star East virtual conference itself, and that's with Teresa Lanowitz starting in 15 minutes.